I'm Tom Baker, this is Chasing Cars, here's a facelift test of Model 3, and today I'm going to be doing a full review of this car. I've really anticipated my first drive of the Model 3 Highland, as the facelifted version was codenamed. The Model 3 is such an important EV, the second most popular EV here in Australia behind the Model Y, but I prefer the sedan packaging of this car. The pre-facelift version was very well rounded, but it was a little bit rough around the edges. Great car for early adopters, has become adopted by the mass market. But you know what? The facelift, I reckon, is actually geared towards people like me, cynics and motoring journalists, because this car has been tidied up almost everywhere and mostly in places that you can't see. The new styling is more handsome, I think. That's subjective. Things like the ride quality and the refinement are vastly improved, as we'll find out when we take this vehicle for a drive shortly. We're going to start out with the interior. We'll chat about the practicality, the range, charging, and other running costs of this vehicle, and then we'll find a great road to see what the Model 3 is all about. But before we get started, hit subscribe down below.
Chasing Cars, honest reviews of your next car. Brought to you by
Budget Direct.
Outside, the most obvious changes to the Model 3 involve the relatively deep restyling of the front and rear ends, plus some new alloy wheel designs. And I've got to say, the car looks more mature and more handsome from the outside. And I think that mirrors the fact that the engineering changes to the Model 3 are all 100% geared at making this vehicle feel more premium, more mature, and more like a direct rival to something like a BMW 3 Series. And that is a change from the pre-facelift Model 3. This vehicle has always sat in a kind of grey area between mainstream and premium, and that was totally fine because that's where the price of the Model 3 has been. It's now a little bit more expensive, not by a massive amount, just over 60 grand before on-road costs for this rear-wheel drive. But the perceived quality of this vehicle and actual quality have both really stepped up, which is great to see. So we've jumped inside the Model 3, and the first thing you notice is actually this. Really beautiful sound when the door closes. Immediately an increase to the perceived quality in the thunk in the door. Of course, the acoustics of something like that can be tuned to make it sound better. That's been done, no doubt. The seals might be slightly higher quality as well, but things start well. And then you notice the materials have all had a big upgrade in here. There's an additional level of plushness, lovely stitching features around the place, deeply plush center bin here, and the seats are considerably improved in their material and finish. The last Model 3 and the Model Y, as it continues today, had very sort of squidgy, shiny vinyl seats, which I really did not like. The seats continue to be vinyl, but they've been reshaped, the stitching looks higher quality, and they're perforated because my main bugbear about the interior of the Model 3 has been fixed. Cooled seats, aka ventilated seats, are now standard across the range. That completely changes your comfort level in a hot country like Australia in the Model 3. You can now have the black interior and be comfortable in summer because the seats are cooled. Well done, Tesla, for listening to feedback and implementing it on the Model 3. That's awesome. Now, another piece of feedback Tesla got is that people didn't like the wood anymore. So if you go for the dark interior, you no longer get wood. Instead, the secondary trim is this sort of grey felt. Looks nice, not exactly luxurious, but it feels good. It's totally fine. There's a couple of metal accents here and there too, which look nice. The damping of things like these sliders is all perfect. This is what I mean when this car is on a par with something like a BMW 3 Series. It really is coming along. Now, the technology must be mentioned. 15.4-inch touchscreen. The UI has gotten better and better over the years, and I love that Tesla has actually fixed small things that I've complained about in the past. Like, it used to be quite difficult to find the sound and EQ settings. It's now just right here next to the play bar, exactly what you'd expect. The navigation is easy to use, intuitive, no Apple CarPlay or Android Auto, so you've got to run everything through the car. Thankfully, the internal apps are really well designed. If you want stuff like this satellite map and streaming of your music, that's going to cost $10 a month for premium connectivity, which this car has. Storage is decent. Big bin here with a USB-C port, decent sized cup holders. You can close that off. Another bin here, and large flock-lined door bins too. One big drawback, I would say, is that you still feel like you're sitting on the Model 3 rather than in it. I wish the seats were mounted a bit lower. I wish the seats ensconced you a little bit more. They're still not very tall in terms of their bolsters, but they're fine. And of course, there's the fact there's no speedo in front of you. Frankly, I've gotten used to it now. but it is still, maybe slightly worse to look here compared to straight in front of you, but I think almost everybody will get used to that. Here in the back of the facelift Model 3, we find some quirky stuff that Tesla has done for the update, including incorporating like a really large and beautifully executed screen back here for rear seat passengers. This is one of the nicest rear screens I've ever seen in any car, including like BMW 7 Series, Mercedes S-Class, that sort of thing. But it's odd because here in Australia, I don't think that many people buy the Model 3 to use as a daily family car. So not everybody will actually have passengers back here to enjoy this gorgeous screen. But if you are going to put people in the back, then all power to them. They've got extra climate controls here. They can check out what music's playing. They can watch videos in the back. Really nicely done. Cool feature. But there are a couple of things about the Model 3 which were bad before the facelift, which continue to be bugbears for me now. The first is that, look at my legs. They are not super well supported by the seat base, which is still a little bit low, so you're going to splay your legs in order to get comfortable. The best EVs out there have a more angled rear seat base, which means that you're going to be much more comfortable on longer trips because your legs are supported more easily. More of a problem for people with long legs. I'm 6 foot. I've got longer legs. Second problem, this big, beautiful glass roof. Now, in the colder months, this lets in light and a bit of warmth, and you're going to love it. In the hotter months, in a hot country like Australia, it's December. Here in Sydney, it's summertime. It's currently 33 degrees, and it's not too bad, but you can feel the heat. It's just radiating. This is hot to the touch, and so the heat's just radiating onto my head. Now, I watch a lot of the great Aussie Tesla content out there, content by people like Ryan and Tesla Tom, and some of those guys have fitted sun blinds to the roof of their Teslas, and that's kind of fixed this problem. So if I bought this car, that's what I would do. Otherwise, nice materials feature back here again, those flockline door bins. No center armrest, which is a bit of a letdown, so you've just got to put your hand down here, but you do have your USB ports as well. When it comes to boot space, the Model 3 has 2 of them. Let's start at the back, where I think this vehicle visually is much more appealing than it used to be. The generic tail lights of the pre-facelift version have been replaced with these sort of C-shaped units that look considerably better, and we now have this matte silver finish for the Tesla lettering across the back. Now, it is a power tailgate, and the Model 3 continues to be a sedan. Some people, including myself, had hoped that at the facelift, it might somehow become a hatchback. That hasn't happened. So we deal with a sedan boot opening aperture. Of course, the Model Y is more practical, but the Model 3 is actually quite a bit better to drive, as we'll find out shortly. The boot, however, is enormous. 594 litres is big for a sedan. Something like a BMW 3 Series is 100 litres down on this. Now, there's no spare, always a bit of a bummer for nearly every EV, but there is a huge additional bit of space under the boot floor, and then a button here to close that power tailgate. But this isn't where the luggage capacity stops, because this car's got a frunk. As ever, the frunk can be unlatched through the app or through the touchscreen in the vehicle, opens up super easily, and you get another 88 litres of space, which is going to be good for a carry-on suitcase, a couple of canvas bags, maybe a granny charger if you're going to take this vehicle on a road trip. You've got your washer refiller right there. It's sealed. It's hard plastic in there rather than carpet like something like a Porsche Taycan, but it's very well packaged. The new Model 3 rear-wheel drive was impressively efficient in our real-world testing. In fact, it returned our best ever score for highway efficiency, with its miserly 13 kilowatt-hours per 100 kilometre score, providing 442 k's of real-world highway range. Even though that's only acceptable on our 2024 range scale, the fact you get 442 kilometres from such a small and relatively light 57.5 kilowatt-hour usable LFP battery is an achievement in itself. The car is even more frugal in town, with our urban test returning 12.7 kilowatt-hours per 100 kilometre economy for realistic urban range of 452 k's. Only the Polestar 2 and Hyundai Ioniq 6 rear-wheel drive models have better town efficiency than this car, but the Tesla is more frugal than both on the highway. Later, we'll test the new Model 3 long range, which has a 30% larger lithium-ion battery, which we expect should easily break the 500 kilometre highway range barrier. We haven't yet performed our real-world recharging test on the Model 3, but it's coming soon. Tesla claims 170 kilowatt DC peak charging for the rear-wheel drive model and a 96 kilowatt average charging speed between 10 and 80%. Tesla covers its new cars in Australia with a 4-year, 80,000 kilometre basic vehicle warranty, which does trail most of the industry, while the Model 3 rear-wheel drive's LFP battery is warranted to retain 70% of its original capacity, or 40 kilowatt-hours of usable space, for 8 years and 160,000 kilometers. Servicing is condition-based, and the car alerts you to required maintenance. So now we get to the really good stuff. Certainly, the more handsome exterior and the considerably upgraded interior materials are important to know about when it comes to the 2024 Model 3, but the improvements to this car have actually focused on what's happening under the skin. Now, the rumor mill was pumping out stories before this car got released, talking about massive upgrades in battery density and that sort of thing, but didn't really eventuate. There's a small range improvement. I think it's 22 Ks of extra range on paper for the rear-wheel drive, but largely the battery situation, the motor situation has remained largely the same. The changes have been directed at ride and handling, and that's one area where the Model 3 definitely had room for improvement, at least if you're the kind of person to really care about things like the quality of the damping in a car and just how quiet it can be over coarse surfaces, which are two disciplines that Tesla has seriously focused on with this car. The backstory to the facelift Model 3 is really interesting. We've got a bit of an inkling that Tesla Europe actually did a fair bit of the work on this car, and the priorities feel European. This feels much more targeted at the 3 Series, Mercedes C-Class, and Audi A4 than the pre-facelift version, and the Model 3 really behaves like some of those cars on a back road like this one in how supple and compliant the ride now is. That is a significant difference to the pre-facelift Model 3. The base model didn't ride that badly, but there was an underlying brittleness to the damping in the Model 3 and also a real resonance in terms of suspension noise in the cabin. Both of those things have been nipped in the bud, which is just great to see. This car now has frequency selective damping, a bit like a Kia EV6, and that works really well for providing you with a ride which offers some road feel, but is just really nice and supple, controls bumps, and doesn't allow big whacks to be translated through into the cabin. Our test car is on 18-inch wheels with a bit more sidewall, which is definitely the way to go here in Australia in order to get the best ride quality. The 19-inch wheels look a little bit better, for sure, aesthetically, but the 18s ride really well, so that's how I would probably spec my Model 3. And I would also go for the rear-wheel drive for a couple of reasons. The first one, which maybe isn't the first that comes to mind, is the lightness. Because this car has a relatively small 57.5 kilowatt-hour usable LFP battery, it's pretty light, just over 1,800 kilos. There's plenty of combustion sedans that are heavier than this vehicle, and you feel that lightness on a back road like this in the Model 3, where it's quite unlike most other electric vehicles, which can easily be 500 kilos heavier than this car or more. That's a real differentiator. But of course, being single motor rear-wheel drive, the front wheels are only here to do the steering. Now, dual motor Teslas have a bit of an understeery trait. Their front motors are reasonably powerful, and you definitely get a sense of being pulled rather than pushed until you really are up in the sort of 9/10ths, 10/10ths range of an all-wheel drive Tesla. We certainly don't have that problem here in the rear drive, where we're getting really nice, classic, pure, push-like rear-driven dynamics out of corners, and the steering is uncorrupted. That said, facelift Model 3 isn't perfect. The steering is still pretty lifeless and pretty artificial, and you're left to sort of guess at times about how much grip you do have at the front end. Now, manufacturers can come back from this problem. They can find better ways to do steering, and BMW is a classic example. The previous Gen F30 3 Series didn't have the best steering. The new G23 Series has a much better rack, so that's the sort of thing that Tesla could look to. I'd love to see the second gen Model 3 have more crispness, more feedback, more feel through the steering wheel to give you a bit of extra confidence and a bit of engagement as a driver. The other thing is that the Model 3 still doesn't really let its hair down. In a car like the BMW i4 eDrive 40, you can really induce a bit of movement through the chassis, a bit of oversteer through the rear end. The Model 3 doesn't really want to do that. You can feel its rear drive, but it's very pinned down, very safe dynamics. Perhaps a setting like ESC Sport would be cool just to induce a little bit more feel and feedback to the driver. But of course, that's only for the most keen among us. For most people, the rear drive is a really good way to go. If you want more power and you want a bit more range, the long-range all-wheel drive model is obviously a really good step. It's 10 grand more, but you're really going to notice the difference in terms of performance. Speaking of performance, we have performance tested the Model 3 rear drive independently here at Chasing Cars. Against the claim of 6.1 seconds, it's actually a bit faster. We got 5.8 seconds neat, and when it comes to emergency braking, the Model 3 is pretty impressive. We got just over 35 meters in an emergency stop from 100 to 0, which is good for a sedan of this size. Also, when it comes to safety features, you can of course option a Model 3 with the full self-driving computer. Not available in Australia in beta yet, but it's just a matter of time, I imagine, until that feature becomes accessible to us here. There's also the halfway house of the enhanced autopilot for just over $5,000, which can do a little bit more. It can change lanes while remaining on autopilot, which is annoying that the base autopilot can't do that. You've got to re-engage your adaptive cruise every time you change lanes. This tester is actually equipped with the full self-driving computer, which is interesting. I can't enable it, I can't use it in Australia, but it's fitted to this test car. The reason I call that out is Tesla has never fitted its media cars with full self-driving in Australia before now. I think that shows that there's a degree of confidence coming into the way the cars drive on FSD beta overseas, and maybe it implies that we'll see it in Australia sooner rather than later, so you as customers and people like me will be able to give it a proper test. So those are my impressions of the 2024 Tesla Model 3 rear-wheel drive. To say that I'm impressed would be an understatement. Tesla is coming along at a rapid rate. The fact that it sells some of the best EVs on the market is already something which is highly creditable, but the fact that Tesla is taking on board the sorts of detailed feedback that have come up over the last few years about staple products like the Model 3 is the sign of a company which is becoming a lot more mature than it perhaps has been in prior years. This vehicle, you know how at the start I said it's a little bit more targeted towards the cynics, people like me. It does a very good job of convincing road testers like myself that Tesla really gets what it needs to do to go from good to great. The ride quality, vastly improved. The refinement, considerably improved. And the fact that this is still a well-rounded, easy to recommend EV hasn't changed from the pre-facelift version. Maybe a little bit more range in the rear-wheel drive would be nice, but I also like the fact the battery's been kept nice and light, which makes the dynamics really sparkle on the right road. Well, those are my impressions. Please let me know your views down below in the comments. While you're there, hit subscribe, hit the notification bell, and as always, thank you for watching Chasing Cars.